Hey, so welcome back to another video of SUP'S Garage. So just to give you a little background on the issue on this bike, if you were to cold start it, starts right up. But after warming it up and riding it for quite a while, the issue this bike is having is it won't start. It's gonna seem like this bike has a bad battery, and this is what it sounds like. Sometimes if you try it again, you'll get lucky and it'll actually start up. But let's see if it happens in this case. So there, as you can see, that's the issue we're having on this bike. So in other words, I'm gonna show you how to replace your starter on your 2004 to 2006 R1. So to get started, we're gonna go ahead and remove the tank. And in order to remove the tank, it's actually pretty easy. We gotta move the plastic trims on both sides. All that's holding that down is one bolt on each side. And I already got my bolt off on this side. Do not just pull on this part. It actually has a tab in the front and a little tab towards the center area. You're gonna pull back first and then pull out. As you can see, there's the center tab. And there's the front tab. Front tab sits right here, and that's why I said you gotta pull back and then pull out. Same for the center, you gotta pull back, then pull out. You're gonna do the exact same thing on the other side. So once we get those plastic trims off, now we gotta remove the 3 bolts that are holding the tank down. And then last, we're gonna remove the back bolt. Once we get everything underneath the tank, disconnect it. So we have 2 bolts on each side. One on the right side, one in the center, one on the other side, and then lastly, the bolt on the back of the tank. So just before we remove the last bolt on the back of the tank, be sure to disconnect everything from the fuel pump. The first one I will be removing is the fuel line. To remove this one, you're gonna have to make sure you push in on both sides. As you can see, the gray area there and the gray area on the other side. You're gonna push in on both of those gray clips, push forward, then pull out. If you recently turned on the bike, most likely you still have pressure in this line. Just be sure you don't get any gas on your eyes or on yourself in general. Go ahead and disconnect both of your connections that are connected on the bottom of the fuel pump. Then you're gonna disconnect both of these hoses, which you shouldn't have any fuel coming out of them. And then you should have another hose hanging from the bottom of the fuel pump. Okay, so now we have everything fully disconnected. Now we can go back and continue on the last bolt on the tank. Once you get the last bolt in the back, you should be able to remove the tank easily and just put it aside for now. Go ahead and disconnect your terminals. Next, just go ahead and disconnect this sensor here. There's somewhat of a rubber spacer that sits right here in the sensor. Go ahead and remove it and put it aside so you won't lose it. Next, you're gonna remove 10 screws that hold down the air box. There's gonna be 9 on the outside of the air box. And if you pull this rubber piece, you should also have one in there. It should come off that easy. Then go ahead and remove the air filter. And now we need to continue removing the bottom of the air box. 3 on each side. Go ahead and loosen those up next. Okay, so once we loosen those 6 bolts on top, you're gonna have to remove this hose. To squeeze this and pull it down, and then simply pull the hose off. Also, this hose here that's located in the rear of the air box, simply just pull back. Okay, so now that you got the air box removed, don't get discouraged about how chaotic it looks right now. So to continue on, the thing we're gonna do next is disconnect this wire harness. This main harness here actually disconnects everything that's attached to the throttle body itself. So it'll save you a lot of time. And to remove this harness is pretty simple. Pull up on this tab here and pull back, and it comes right out. Next, we're gonna disconnect these 2 lines here, and you're gonna need some pliers again, just like the airbox hose. So once you disconnect these 2 hoses, be aware that you might leak some coolant. It's not gonna be too much, and it shouldn't be flowing consistently. So the next bolts we gotta loosen are the bolts that are actually connecting the throttle body to the engine itself. You got 1 there. Now you can't see the second one because it's actually underneath this piece here. And then you got 2 more on the right side. Now you should be able to get these 3 bolts on this side and the left side of the engine. This last side is you're gonna have to disconnect it from this side of the engine. You're not gonna have to remove the entire fairings on both left and right side. Loosen 4 more screws, 1 here, 1 there, 1 here, and 1 there. It's gonna be the same thing on the other side. Now you shouldn't have this much space. Taking this plastic piece off, I'm just finding out that the upper stay is broken on this bike, as you can see. And that's basically what holds the whole front end on this bike. But that's a separate problem. I'll probably end up fixing that. But going back to this part, once you get those 4 screws loosened, you should have better access to this bolt in front and 2 more bolts in the back. So once you get the plastic centerpiece off, as you can see, now you have access to those bolts. It might be a little hard to get the ones in the back, but it is possible. You're just gonna have to have an extension with the correct Allen size, and you should be able to get all 3 from this side. And just to give you an idea of what I use to get these 3 bolts out, I use this screwdriver here that I could attach a long extension to be able to attach to any kind of bit size. So just to show you on the top view, I already got the first one loosened up, and you can't really see, but I'm already on the second one. As you can see, I'm loosening it, and now moving on to the third one and loosening it. You're only loosening it, you're not removing it completely. And now to move on to the 4th one, as you can see, it's angled the opposite way. So again, we're gonna have to do the same thing we did to the other side. Remove the centerpiece, and we should have access to the last bolt. All right, so to be honest with you, 4th one's always the hardest, and that's just because depending on what tool you use, you gotta angle it right to get in where that 4th bolt is at. And when putting in your tool to get it angled in there, just be careful you don't rip any wires or any hoses trying to force this tool in. Okay, so the next thing after loosening all 4 of those bolts that's holding down the throttle body, what I like to use is something to pry up with. Now on this part, you gotta be very careful because you don't wanna put too much force on this throttle body because it can break or even crack. You want to angle whatever you're using to pry up on the throttle body on the corners carefully. You don't want to put too much force, just a little bit, just to pull up, just to feel it pop off like it did just now. So on the left side, as you can see, it's already loosened. We're going to do the same thing on the right. So now that we're on the other side, we're going to do the exact same thing we did on this side, just on the very edge, on the corner, wiggle it out. I'm not putting much force on this at all. And there you have it. Bottom of the throttle bodies are no longer connected to the engine. And the cable for the idle control screw is going to be located on the left side of the bike, right next to your shift link. All you got to do to remove this one is just pull up, just like that. There's going to be one more hose that we have to disconnect on the back of the throttle body, and it's going to be this center one right here. Just pinch this clamp, move it back. These plastic T-connectors can get very brittle, so just be very careful sliding that hose out. Remove it and put it aside for now, but just remember where that specific hose goes back onto the rear of the throttle body. You're gonna go ahead and grab your idle screw that we disattached from the left side of the bike and just simply pull it out. Next, I gotta disconnect my throttle cables, and I'm gonna start with the top one. Take a picture or video because you wanna put it exactly how it was before, because you don't wanna have any issues once you put all this back together and your throttle might feel loose or too tight. You're gonna have to use a size 10 wrench to get that loosened. Once loosened, you should be able to do it by hand. As you can see, now you can slide this cable out. Next, we're going to do the same to the bottom. We're going to loosen that one and remove it from its slot. Now, as you can see, just remember, in my case, to know which one goes on top and which one goes on bottom, mine has a different color. Top one has a darker color and the bottom one is more of a silver. So that's what I'm going to use to remember which one goes where. In your case, if for any reason yours is the same color, it's not a big deal. Use a marker to remind you which cable goes where. Okay, so now as you can see, I got both of them already taken off from the bracket. The next part we got to disassemble is these two screws on the throttle side of the bike. Once we take these two screws off, you're going to see two cables attached to this part here. We're going to remove those. So now that we have this open, there's the two cables that we're going to have to remove. And because we already loosened them on the throttle body side, these cables should be pretty loose just to remove. The right side stays on the right on top and the left side stays on the left on top. So we're going to go ahead and disconnect these cables. And to do that, pull up all the way and get it out of the slot. Once you remove one side, it should be even easier to do the other side. We're gonna leave this alone. We don't need to touch it until we reassemble the throttle body back on the engine. Now we're gonna have to do the exact same thing on this side here. I'm not gonna be able to show you that very well on camera, but it's also gonna have a groove just like on the throttle handle, and you just gotta pull that cable out. Same thing for the bottom cable. You just gotta put it in that groove and pull the cable out. So once you're this far, you got those two cables removed, you should be able to move around the throttle body, but there is one sensor you do have to remove, that green one on the bottom. And the only reason I couldn't do that before is because we had all this in the way. Once the throttle body is removed, it's pretty easy to remove that connector. We got the throttle bodies completely out of the way. Now we have access to the starter finally. But before moving forward, you need to make sure all four of these openings are covered with the rag just to make sure nothing falls in there. Because if you have anything that falls in there, you just made this job a lot bigger. So please just make sure you take 2 seconds of your time to make sure those openings are all covered. Okay, so now that I got that out of the way, all we have left to do is to remove 3 bolts. This small one here that actually puts power to the starter, and the 2 bolts on the side that actually hold the starter in place. Now I've seen on the 2004 and 2005 models, the thermostat housing is more in the way, but I still have been able to remove the starter on those specific year models without removing the thermostat housing. Okay, so once you remove all 3 bolts, you're gonna have to put a little pressure on the starter to make it come out. I'm using the same thing I used on the throttle body just to get between the starter and the engine, for I could use that to pry against, and just simply put pressure on it to push it out. Once you have it out, you might have to maneuver it a certain way to get the starter out, but it will come out. And there you have it, we finally got the starter out. Okay, so this is the old starter, which we're not even gonna mess with. Here's our new one in the package. Comes with a cap, which we gotta remove. Also a rubber cap where the power wire goes. So before we install this, we wanna make sure we put a little bit of oil just to be sure that this gasket doesn't go in there dry, because that can cause it to rip, and we don't wanna wait on any more parts. Okay, so before we put the starter back on the engine, we want to make sure that the area where the gasket of the starter sits is nice and clean. All right, now we're ready to put the new starter in. Just be patient. Find the angle that's best for you to put this starter back in. Once you have your starter in, go ahead and put in the 2 bolts that actually hold the starter in place. And then go ahead and connect the cable that has power going to the starter. Don't forget to put the rubber boot that goes over the power wire. Moving along, we're gonna go ahead and put our throttle bodies back on. But before we do, I find the easiest way to put the throttle bodies back in is to put a little bit of grease inside these rubber mounts. You don't want to put too much, just a very thin layer to have the throttle body slide in very easily. We're gonna go ahead and connect our throttle cables back on here, which I'm not gonna be able to get on camera very well. Now, before you put both of them on, make sure to tighten the bottom one first, then move on to the top one and tighten that one. And now we can connect our temperature sensor back on, which remember, it goes all the way down there. You don't wanna forget that, because once this throttle body's back in place, it's gonna be really hard to get back deep in there to get that connector on. Now, this next part can get a little bit tedious. So make sure that the throttle bodies are sitting exactly on top of each of its individual rubber tube. Once you got that in place, and make sure there's nothing in between, you're gonna push down firmly, and you might have to position the throttle body as you're pushing down, and then eventually it will snap in place. And then just make sure that the throttle bodies are sitting all the way down on the rubber boot on the left and right side. Now at this point, we can connect everything that we disconnected in the beginning back in place. So I'll start off with these two. I'm gonna go ahead and put my clamps on. Then don't forget about this small bottom tube. Be very gentle with this, because remember, these T-brackets can break easily. Now don't forget to reroute your throttle adjustment screw. Next is gonna be the main wire harness that connects everything from the throttle body to the bike. And remember, the right goes on the right side and the left goes on the left side. And this plastic top here that holds the cables stays upwards. For me, it really doesn't matter what side you start on first. All right, now we got them both in. Just make sure they're sitting in there correctly. Now all we gotta do is close this back and put our 2 bolts back on. Now once you got everything back on your handle, at this point you wanna make sure that you did it correctly by pulling back. And if you did this correctly, it should pull back on its own. Now we can continue moving forward. All right, next we're gonna go ahead and put our air box back in. Don't forget to connect the hose on the left side of the bike that goes on the bottom of the air box. Okay, now that we have the top of the air box back on, now we're just gonna screw the 6 bolts. Now we're gonna put our air filter back on and reinstall the top of the air box along with the screws that hold it down. Don't forget to put this rubber piece back in the center if you have it, and this rubber-like spacer that goes here on the sensor. Since we already have the air box back in place, go ahead and reattach the hose that's connected on the bottom of the air box. Next, we can go ahead and install the gas tank back on. Now just put something there to hold up your tank up. I personally like to use a rubber mallet. And now we can start connecting everything back here on the bottom of the tank, which should be the 2 fuel lines, the 2 wire connections, and the 2 little hoses on the left side of the tank. Okay, so once you've already connected everything on the bottom of the tank, go ahead and connect your 3 bolts that hold the tank down. You're gonna bolt on the bolts on both sides of the tank, and then your center bolt. Go ahead and reconnect your battery, negative with negative and positive with positive. Now at this point, you just wanna make sure that the starter you just installed works correctly. Now my speedometer is not gonna work because I got all the wires on the right side disconnected, because I'm still gonna take the front end plastics off for another thing that I got going on. But I don't need that to get the bike started. Okay, let's see if this works. So of course at this point, just put your plastics back on. Just reverse the steps that we did in the beginning of the video. But like I said earlier, I'm gonna go ahead and remove all the plastics on this bike because it's actually going full black at this point. And if you're interested to see what it looks like when it's all said and done, go ahead and add me on Instagram where you can see what this bike looks like when it's done and any updates that come along in the garage. So that's gonna put an end to this video, guys. If you like what you see, if this helped you out in any way, please hit the like button for me. And if you want to see more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button to show your support. But like always, God bless every single one of y'all, and we'll see y'all on the next video.